HR called me in. "We know you've been working 2 jobs. You're terminated effective immediately." I didn't argue. I just smiled and said, "You're right, I should focus on one." They had no idea what my second job was. 72 hours later, there were 2 of them waiting in the conference room on the 4th floor, the one with the glass walls that looked out over the open plan bullpen where I had spent the better part of 4 years. I knew that room well. I had sat in it for onboarding, for performance reviews, for the quarterly all-hands where the executive team handed out branded water bottles and called it recognition. The HR director was seated at the head of the table, 2 documents arranged in front of her with the precision of someone who wanted the meeting to feel official before it had started. The one on the left was a copy of my employment agreement, the relevant section flagged with a yellow tab. The one on the right was the termination letter, already signed at the bottom. To her right sat my direct manager. His arms were crossed. He was wearing the expression of a man trying to appear disappointed, and he was not pulling it off. I had worked alongside him for 4 years. I knew what satisfied looked like on his face. This was it. I sat down. I did not offer a greeting. Silence in situations like these tends to unnerve people more than any prepared statement, particularly when the other party has rehearsed extensively and needs a specific kind of response to proceed correctly. The HR director said they had become aware that I was engaged in secondary employment while under contract with the company. She said this was a violation of Section 9 of my employment agreement. She said the termination was effective immediately and that security would escort me to collect my personal items. She slid the termination letter across the table. I looked at it without touching it. My name at the top, a paragraph of dense contractual language below it, a signature at the bottom from someone I had never met. They had surveillance photos, parking garage footage, grainy and time-stamped, a figure in a gray coat entering an office building downtown on a Tuesday evening 2 weeks prior. The resolution was poor enough that I could have credibly argued it was not me. I chose not to. I asked to see the images. I looked at them for a moment. I looked back at the HR director. My manager shifted in his chair. He had been waiting for what he came to see, the performance of distress. He had arranged this meeting in order to be present for it. I understood that clearly now. I signed the document. I capped the pen and set it on the table with a quiet, precise click. I stood up and I said, "You're right. I should focus on one." My manager blinked. The HR director's posture shifted, the micro-adjustment of someone whose script has been declined. They had anticipated anger, tears, denial. They had written their versions of what would happen next, and I had declined to read from any of them. Security was waiting outside the door, the guard from the lobby downstairs. He said he was sorry. I told him it was fine. I told him I knew where my desk was. I was calm in the way that you are calm when something you have been anticipating has finally arrived. Meridian Group had come to the company 7 months before I did. They were a mid-sized logistics and supply chain firm in the middle of a significant overhaul, modernizing vendor management systems, integrating new compliance software across 3 regional divisions, renegotiating service contracts that had outlived their original terms. They needed someone with deep institutional patience and the operational judgment to manage a complex transition without disrupting daily operations, the kind of client that rewards consistent follow-through and punishes overpromising. When I was brought on, Meridian was assigned to me in my 3rd week. My predecessor had apparently not taken it seriously. I read every document in the handoff folder over a weekend, the full contracts, the legacy meeting notes, the communication history going back 22 months. By Monday morning, I had 19 questions and a preliminary plan for the next 2 quarters. My manager said the plan was probably more thorough than necessary. By the end of my 1st year, the contract had grown from $1.1 million annually to just under $1.9 million. By the end of my 2nd, it was $2.4 million. Not because I was a salesperson, I am not, but because I did what I said I would do, within the time frame I committed to, at the quality level I represented. I responded within the hour. I caught problems before the client encountered them. I learned the names of every stakeholder, knew their internal politics, knew which VP was gunning for which budget, who made actual decisions versus who attended meetings about them. I learned that Meridian's VP of operations, the man who would later change the direction of my professional life in a parking structure, had been with the company for 19 years and was deeply skeptical of vendor relationships by nature, having been burned twice by arrangements that were oversold and underdelivered. That he measured a professional relationship's quality in response times and accuracy, not presentations or dinners. That, asking directly about a legal concern their previous account lead had never addressed, a data handling issue buried in an old meeting note, did more for the relationship than the previous 8 months of otherwise competent service. I built the account the way anything of lasting value is built, slowly, carefully, with attention to things other people considered beneath their notice or outside their job description. At 7 in the morning before anyone arrived, at 10 at night when time zones required it, on Saturdays when something was due Monday and I had not been given the additional support that would have allowed it to be done otherwise. What I was not building during those 4 years was any meaningful protection for myself within the organization. I was making myself indispensable to a client while making myself invisible to my employer. I did not fully understand the relationship between those 2 facts until I needed to. My manager had been with the company for 11 years when I arrived. 11 years had given him a kind of institutional gravity, distinct from from any particular competence. He was part of the furniture in a way that made him difficult to question. He understood the organization's internal rhythms, its political geography, the specific sensitivities of each executive above him. In the narrow sense, he was very good at his job, which was not the job on his title, but the job of managing upward perception. He was not stupid. I want to be precise about that, because stupidity would have been simpler to navigate. He was strategic in a careful, practiced way. He understood exactly how credit moved through an organization, and he positioned himself in its path. He knew which meetings required his visible presence and which could proceed without him. He understood which communications needed his name attached and which were better attributed vaguely to the team or the department. When he was given Meridian, along with me, he had inherited a high-performing account and a person who understood it entirely. From his perspective, the account had simply arrived in his portfolio and continued to function without requiring his involvement. He attended the annual reviews. He joined quarterly calls when the CEO was watching. He sent follow-up emails I had drafted, with a single line of his own added at the top. He gave presentations built on slide decks I had assembled the night before. Every bonus he received for client retention excellence was built on work he had not done. Not once did he say so. It took me time to understand that this was not careless. It was deliberate. He was not forgetting to credit me. He was choosing not to. There is a meaningful difference, and recognizing it changed how I understood my situation. What compounded it was the information asymmetry he maintained carefully. He knew his value to the department depended on his apparent proximity to Meridian, and he managed that proximity, inserting himself into communications at specific moments, forwarding my emails with his framing added, ensuring that at the executive level, the account appeared to exist within his orbit rather than mine. He never sabotaged the work. There was no need. He simply ensured that from the outside, my work appeared to be an extension of his. I raised the salary question with him twice, each time with data. The first time he said the timing was not right and he was going to bat for me. The second time he said the budget cycle made it complicated. I stopped raising it after that and started documenting. There is a specific quality to the erosion of professional respect that is different from other kinds of loss. It does not arrive as a single event. It accumulates quietly until the structure it has been weakening reveals itself as something that can no longer hold. The salary conversations came first, not the ones I have described, but earlier, smaller ones. The 14th month, when I first formally requested a review of my compensation after my responsibilities had significantly expanded. He said I was doing exceptional work. He said he would look into it. He said it every quarter for a year, with a different explanation each time, until I understood the explanation was the point, that the conversation was designed to absorb the request without resolving it. I started documenting, not aggressively, not with any specific intention in those early months, just tracking, the way a careful professional tracks things that might matter later. Each quarterly report with my name absent from the attribution. Each communication in which the account's performance was described in the passive voice, as if growth had happened to the department rather than been produced by a specific person doing specific work. Each instance of our relationship with Meridian deployed by someone who had not built that relationship. The specific moment that moved things from tolerance to decision was a Monday afternoon in the 3rd month of my 4th year. I had spent the previous Friday negotiating a contract amendment with Meridian's procurement team, a scope expansion worth $340,000 annually, the result of 6 weeks of preparation and 3 rounds of difficult conversations. I had been on the final call until 8:15 from a coffee shop because the procurement director's time zone required it. I sent the finalized amendment to my manager that evening with a summary of what had been achieved. Monday morning, the CEO sent an all-staff email congratulating my manager on securing a major contract expansion. My manager's reply read, "Thank you. The team worked hard on this one." The team. There was no team. I had negotiated that amendment alone from a coffee shop on a Friday evening. I read the thread 3 times. Then I opened my project notes and began, in the margin of a meeting agenda, to think seriously about what I was going to do next. The trip to Meridian's regional headquarters was scheduled as a standard biannual service review, the 6th I had done with this client, with a routine refined through repetition into something efficient and very nearly comfortable. 2 days of focused sessions with their operations, compliance, and procurement teams, a structured agenda, the kind of engagement that required preparation rather than improvisation, because I knew the account well enough that very little there surprised me. I flew out on a Monday morning at 6:15. I had done this flight enough times to have preferences about it. The seat, the coffee at the one stand open before 5, the particular early morning clarity of an airport that has not yet accumulated the noise of a full day. I find early morning airports clarifying. I do some of my clearest thinking in them. The first day at Meridian was back-to-back sessions. The morning with their compliance team on the regulatory update timeline. The early afternoon with 2 operations representatives who had questions about the service agreement renewal. The late afternoon with the project coordinator Dara, who had been my primary operational contact for 3 years and who communicated with a precision I had always appreciated. We closed 7 of 9 outstanding items in 90 minutes. Before we finished, Dara mentioned that Meridian had nearly gone to market last renewal cycle, that a competitor had approached them with a lower rate and a dedicated account structure. She mentioned it in the neutral way she mentioned most things, as information, not as a conversation. She said the VP had declined without extended deliberation. I noted this and moved on. The second day, a morning session with the VP and his department head, a working lunch with the broader team, an afternoon for documentation and open questions. The morning session was substantive. The VP asked sharp questions about capacity for a compliance expansion they were considering. He had been in operations leadership for 19 years and operated with the particular authority of someone who knows their subject so well they no longer need to signal it. At lunch, his department head told me the reason the competitor had been declined. He said it simply, as if it were obvious. We're not buying a service. We're working with a specific person. If that person isn't there, we're not interested. I received this with a nod and redirected the conversation. The VP caught me in the parking structure at the end of the second afternoon. He had come down a different way than the main exit, and I had the impression it was not accidental. He said what he had to say directly, without the ambient framing that people sometimes use when delivering something with weight behind it. He said that when Meridian renewed the contract 8 months ago, the internal discussion had been brief, that there had been a conversation about going to market, running a proper evaluation, that the conclusion had been that there was no point. He said, the relationship has always been with you, not the company. If you ever decide to make a move, call me before you make any other calls. He handed me his card. We had already exchanged cards that morning, and said, I mean it. Then he walked back toward the building. I stood in the parking structure for a moment after he left. Then I picked up my bag, found my car, and drove to the airport. I did not review documents on the return flight. I looked out the window at the ground below and thought about what had been offered and what it said about the value of what I had spent 4 years building. I flew home Tuesday evening, delayed by 40 minutes, landing after 10 and back at my apartment near midnight. I checked on my daughter, asleep, reading light still on, book face down on the pillow. I turned the light off and went to make tea. I sat at the kitchen table until 1 in the morning. The question was not whether I was going to act on what the VP had said. I recognized even that night that the question of whether had already answered itself. The question was whether I was going to act on it with the same standard of care and preparation I brought to everything else professionally or impulsively in the emotional wake of the moment. I have a particular intolerance for my own impulsivity. The moments I have been most proud of were almost always the ones that involved patience. I sat with it for the full week after the trip, turning it over while doing the actual work, running calls, managing deliverables, attending the department meeting where my manager used a term I had coined in a report without attribution. By Sunday evening, the question of whether had resolved. What remained was how. My employment agreement contained a non-solicitation clause that prohibited me from directly approaching clients for 12 months following my departure. I had read that clause carefully on signing day and approximately 15 times since, in the specific way that you reread a constraint you expect to eventually need to navigate. The key word on my reading was directly. The clause addressed active solicitation, me approaching Meridian, me initiating the conversation. It did not address a client approaching me, or my accepting work from a client who had initiated contact independently. I retained a lawyer. We met twice, remotely, reviewed the contract language in detail. Her conclusion aligned with my reading, with the standard qualifications. She noted the specific ways a former employer could attempt to challenge the arrangement and advised on structural steps that would make a challenge less viable. I called the VP from my car on a Friday afternoon, parked outside a coffee shop while my daughter was at a school activity. I told him I was building the infrastructure to work independently and would be in touch when it was ready. The call lasted 4 minutes. He said, good. He said, let me know what you need from our end. He said, we'll be ready. I thanked him and hung up and sat for a moment in the car. Then I went inside, got a coffee, and sat at a window table for an hour, alone, in the particular quiet that follows a decision that has finally been made. I formed the LLC on a Saturday morning in mid-October. The state's online registration portal was straightforward. I had a name for the entity, a separate email address, a business bank account I had opened the previous Thursday at a branch across town from the one I normally used. The whole process took 45 minutes, including the time I spent reading every field twice before submitting. There is something unexpectedly definitive about clicking the button that registers a business. The confirmation email that arrives within minutes is entirely ordinary. Form language, reference numbers, next steps, and it is the formal existence of something that did not exist before. The rhythm of the following 11 weeks was consistent. My daughter went to bed between 8:30 and 9. I would say goodnight, close her door, make coffee, and sit at the kitchen table with the laptop. I used the kitchen table deliberately. My desk in the home office had the atmosphere of the day job, and I did not want the two to contaminate each other. 1 week, the work was the service agreement, drafting it, revising it, sending specific questions to my lawyer, and receiving precise answers by the following morning. Another week, it was the rate structure, the question of what my time was actually worth when the artificial constraint of an employment relationship that had been undervaluing it for 4 years was removed. I did this calculation carefully, using industry data and billing rate surveys and the specific reference point of what the VP had said in the parking structure, that they had renewed a $2.4 million annual contract specifically because of one person, which has a fairly direct bearing on what that person's time is worth on the open open market. Another week it was the compliance framework, the insurance requirements, the operational infrastructure of a small professional services firm. I had professional experience with all of this from the client side, from years of working through these same structures with Meridian, which meant I was not starting from zero. The service agreement went through 3 drafts. My lawyer reviewed each one and returned specific actionable notes. On the second review, she flagged 2 clauses that needed reworking and added a provision I had not included that turned out to be important. Meridian's general counsel received the final draft through back channels arranged by the VP, characterized as a preliminary review for a potential future engagement. Their GC took 11 days, returned 2 minor amendments, and the document was signed. I printed the executed copies at the library and drove to the law firm downtown on a Tuesday evening to drop them off. On the way home, I bought the ingredients for the pasta I make when something deserves to be marked. I cooked it, opened a bottle of wine, and ate at the kitchen table while my daughter told me about her day. I did not tell her what the evening meant. There would be time for that later. The Tuesday evening in question was the 14th of the month. I know the date precisely because it was the evening before my Meridian quarterly call, which I had spent that day preparing for. The building they identified in the surveillance footage was 11 blocks from my office, on a street with 3 law firms, a title company, and 2 commercial real estate brokerages. I had parked in the attached garage. I rode the elevator to the 9th floor, met the attorney in a small conference room, and we reviewed the executed service agreement, discussed the practical questions around the transition, and went through her remaining advice on conduct during the post-departure period. The meeting lasted 43 minutes. I left at 8:03. The parking receipt shows the timestamp. I drove home, stopped for gas, and was back by 8:49. My daughter was finishing homework at the kitchen table. I made tea and sat across from her while she worked through the last of it. The following morning, I ran the quarterly Meridian call. It was focused and productive. The VP was on for the first 20 minutes. Before dropping off for another meeting, he said, "Great as always." He said it the way he says things, briefly, without decoration, as a fact. 3 days later, I was called into the conference room on the 4th floor. I did not know until that meeting that the parking garage footage existed. I did not know that someone at the company had connected my car, the building, and something they had apparently been looking for a reason to act on. My manager had apparently been asking HR about the secondary employment policy for some time. When the footage appeared, the decision was made quickly. He needed something definitive. The footage gave him the shape of a conclusion even if the content was wrong, and in a company already inclined to believe what was being suggested, the shape was enough. Security was waiting outside the conference room door. The guard from the lobby downstairs had the particular expression of someone doing a job they did not enjoy, which I respected. He said he was sorry. I told him it was fine and that I knew where my desk was. The walk from the 4th floor conference room to my desk on the 3rd took 3 minutes via the stairwell. I had always used the stairs. I had not heavily personalized the desk. A coffee mug bought at a museum gift shop 3 years ago. A small succulent that had survived 4 years through indifference and correct light. An external hard drive in the back drawer containing 4 years of personal project notes, first drafts, and reference materials that belonged to me rather than to the company whose time surrounded their creation. The security guard stood at a distance while I packed these into the cardboard box the company had provided. My manager appeared at the edge of the desk area. He had his hands in his pockets. He said something about hoping the transition would be smooth. Professional exit language deployed as human contact. Something about wishing me well. Something about how these situations sometimes turned out to be opportunities. I told him I was sure the transition would be smooth. I met his eyes when I said it. The lobby was in its mid-afternoon state. The front door opened and I was on the street. The afternoon had turned cold. I had come in wearing a lighter jacket and felt the temperature immediately on my face and hands. I walked 3 blocks to the parking garage, put the box in the trunk, and got into the car. I sat for a moment without starting the engine, not for any emotional reason. A practical inventory of what needed to happen next and in what order. The list was not long. The infrastructure was already in place. What remained was a specific kind of waiting, and I had prepared for the waiting the same way I had prepared for everything else. I started the car. I drove home through the mid-afternoon traffic with the radio on, the public station that plays classical music in the afternoons. When I got home, I made coffee, the pour-over, the slow kind. I made it carefully and stood at the counter watching it and thought about nothing in particular. The first evening was quiet, in a way that felt deliberate. I made coffee and drank it at the kitchen table. I did not open the laptop. I did not check any email. I sat at the table and let the late afternoon light be what it was. The particular light of a Tuesday afternoon in my kitchen, which I had not had the occasion to observe in the middle of a Tuesday, in longer than I could accurately place. My daughter came home at 5:15, dropped her bag in the hallway with her usual decisiveness, and asked if something had happened. I said I was in a transitional period. She looked at me with the specific attention of a 12-year-old who suspects the adult version is simpler than the true one, and then she said, "Okay," and went to her room. We made dinner together. She was in a phase of wanting to learn to cook a specific dish that involved more garlic than I was willing to deploy on a weeknight. We made it. I quietly reduced the garlic by half while she was looking at her phone. It was a good dinner. After she went to bed, I went through the practical list I had been composing mentally since the drive home. The LLC was established. The service agreement was executed. The business bank account was open. The lawyer employer had the relevant documents. The website was in draft. What remained was waiting, not passive waiting, but deliberate waiting, with a specific duration and purpose. I had committed to making no contact with Meridian until they contacted me. The next move was theirs, and the interval between my departure and their response was information I did not need to influence. The second morning, I woke at my usual time, lay in bed for 10 minutes, which I do not normally do, and then got up and made the pour-over coffee. I took my daughter to school. I went for a run, 4 miles through the park and along the river path in the cold that had deepened overnight. When I came back, I made eggs and sat with a book for an hour, something I had not done on a weekday morning in approximately 3 years. That evening, I called my sister. We talked for an hour about things unrelated to work. She asked how things were professionally. I said I was in transition. She said okay, and moved on without pressing. Wednesday evening, washing the dinner dishes, my phone lit on the counter with a message from an unsaved number. Heard the news. Board meets tomorrow morning. Call you after. I dried my hands. I read it twice. I set the phone face down and finished the dishes. I went to sleep at 10:15. I slept 8 uninterrupted hours, which had not happened in so long that I briefly woke in the night to confirm it was still dark. The call came at 9:14. I was at the kitchen table with the pour-over and the novel I had been reading in short stretches all week. My daughter had left for school. The apartment was in its mid-morning weekday quiet, the quiet that belongs to a category of time that working people rarely occupy, that has a suspended quality, something between permission and distance. The number on the screen was the VP's direct line. I let it ring once before answering. He said he would be straight with me. The board had met that morning, first session of the day. They had been aware of my situation since Tuesday evening. The networks in that industry move information efficiently, and Meridian's leadership was well connected within them. They had discussed the transition. His team had asked to be kept informed. He said the contract had been approved. Full scope, 12-month retainer with an option to extend to 24. The rate was the figure from the service agreement. The start date was my call. I said Monday would work. He was quiet for a moment. Then, good. He said their GC had the paperwork ready, and it was a formality. He said his operations team had been told and were, he used the word relieved, and I believed he meant it precisely. Before hanging up, he said, for what it's worth, this was never a complicated decision for us. I thanked him. I set the phone on the table. I sat with it for a few minutes, not dramatically, just letting the proportions settle. I had built something over 11 weeks in the hours after my daughter went to sleep, at a kitchen table, in the background of a professional life I was not willing to continue in. It had worked, not through luck, through preparation, and through the quiet fact that the account had always been mine, not in any formal sense, but in every sense that determined outcomes. I picked up the book and read for another 20 minutes. It felt like exactly the right thing to do. At 1:47, I was making lunch, grilled cheese because the day called for it, when my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately, my former company's CEO. I had his number from a period 2 years prior when we communicated regularly about Meridian. I let it go to voicemail. I finished the sandwich. I poured water. I ate. Then I picked up the phone and listened. The CEO's voice in the recording was in a register I had not heard from him before. He was a direct man by nature. Direct in meetings, direct in email, direct in the way that people who have held executive authority for a long time become direct because they no longer need to manage impressions. This message was not direct. It was careful. Someone had advised him on what to say, and the distance between his natural register and the advised one was audible. He said he was calling because matters had come to his attention regarding the recent transition. He said the executive team had reviewed the situation, and there was a sense the process had been executed with less than ideal deliberation. He said there was significant interest in exploring a path forward that worked for all parties. He mentioned the company's relationship with Meridian, which had always been valued, as if value were a quality the relationship had generated independently, rather than something a specific person had built one call and one visit and one careful email at a time. He said he hoped we could connect later in the week if I was open to it. He said he was looking forward to hearing from me. I set my phone face down on the counter and finished making lunch. I never called back. I did not take the weekend passively. Saturday was spent at the kitchen table with the Meridian engagement plan for the first 90 days, the map I had drafted the week before, now updated with specifics from the board approval. The VP's operations team had communicated priorities through the project coordinator, and I was building the sequence around those while incorporating the open items from the last quarterly call. The work was familiar in its substance and completely different in its context. I had known this intellectually, but experiencing it was another thing. Familiar work, done as yourself, inside something you built, has a different quality than the same work done inside someone else's structure with someone else's name at the top. I had not experienced the former in 4 years, and I had forgotten what it felt like. Sunday afternoon, I told my daughter. We were on the couch after lunch. I said, I want to tell you something about work. She put her phone down and looked at me. The full attention she gives things when she is genuinely paying it. I told her I had left my job, that in the months before leaving, I had built something new. A small company, just me, focused on the account management work I had been doing for 4 years, but now on my own terms, at my own rate. That the client she had heard referenced at dinner for years, Meridian, was my first client, and the arrangement was already in place and starting Monday. That the financial financial situation was better, not worse. She listened to all of this. Then she said, "So you planned it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "How long?" I said, "Almost 3 months." She sat with that. Then, "Did you know it would work?" I thought about the question. I said, "I knew what I had built and I trusted the structure of it." She nodded. She picked up her phone. A few minutes later, without looking up. I think that's actually kind of impressive. Monday morning, I drove to Meridian's offices for the first time in my own capacity. A brief initial meeting, the VP, his department head, and Dara from project coordination. 2 hours. At the end, Dara shook my hand and said, "Honestly, this is just better for everyone." She said it plainly, as a professional fact. I drove home and opened the first invoice of the business. The number on it was real. It reflected 4 years of work at the rate that work had actually always been worth. I sent it at 10 past noon on a Tuesday. It was paid by Friday. I learned what followed through the informal channels that any well-connected professional in a mid-sized industry eventually develops. The network that circulates significant information efficiently and without particular agenda. The first indication came the week after my departure. A former colleague reached out to ask how I was doing. The timing was specific enough that I understood the subtext immediately. I told her I had landed well. She said she was glad. Then she said, "Meridian gave notice, 30-day notice, the contractual minimum." The company responded by attempting to negotiate a continuation, pricing adjustments, alternative service structures, requests for an extension. Meridian's position, communicated through their counsel, was consistent and brief. The relationship had been with a specific individual rather than with the organization. That individual was no longer with the organization, and therefore the basis of the engagement had changed. The notice stood. The $2.4 million annual contract was not, in isolation, catastrophic for a company of that size, but it represented approximately 60% of the department's revenue, and the department was not structured to absorb that loss without consequences. The documentation of this risk, the documentation I had submitted in quarterly reviews for the previous 2 years, filed in the category of things to be addressed when circumstances permitted, was retrieved from those files now, when it was no longer actionable. Another former colleague messaged me 6 weeks after my departure, more directly. She said the team had been told the Meridian loss was attributable to client-side budget changes. She said no one believed it. She said the CEO had spent the first week in back-to-back closed-door sessions with the executive team, and that the mood in those sessions, communicated through the body language of executives emerging from difficult rooms, had been poor. She said, "Do you know the new account lead has been presenting your quarterly framework with your name still in the header? Your manager didn't notice." She said one more thing before ending the conversation. "You built that account from nothing, and everyone who actually worked on it knew it. I just wanted you to know that someone said it directly." I have thought occasionally about my manager since then, whether the restructuring that followed the Meridian departure affected him specifically, whether the experience produced any reflection, or whether it was processed in the way he had always processed inconvenient realities, categorized as external circumstance, and moved past. I find I have no particular feeling about it in either direction. He made the choices he made within the structure that permitted them. The structure produced the consequences that structures like that always eventually produce. They fell where they fell. The formal restructuring was announced 8 weeks after my departure. The department was reduced. The account management function was reorganized. My manager's title changed in the ways these changes typically register. A reduction in scope, the kind that does not officially constitute a demotion. I noted this when I heard it and moved on. 7 months have passed. The Meridian engagement is running well. The first 2 quarters exceeded the targets in the plan I drafted that Saturday morning before the first Monday. The VP mentioned in our last monthly call that their procurement team is in early conversations about a scope expansion, a new compliance vertical with requirements they want addressed in the way they have come to expect, which is thoroughly, accurately, and without drama. I have a second client, introduced through Meridian's general counsel, who mentioned my work in passing to a colleague with a relevant need. The rate is good. The work is interesting. The relationship is straightforward in the clean way that professional relationships are when no one needs to perform anything. I work from the kitchen table most mornings. The same table where I drafted the service agreement, incorporated the LLC, sat at 1 in the morning the Tuesday after the site visit, beginning to understand what I was going to do. It has a different quality now, simply the place where I work, without the shadow of the other life running alongside it. My daughter knows the complete story. I told it to her in pieces over several conversations, in the way that seemed right. She asked why I had not confronted anyone directly. I said because confrontation in that context would have produced a defensive response, and nothing structural would have changed. She asked why I had not left earlier. I said because I was not ready, and building something real takes the time it takes, and the timing of the departure mattered as much as the departure itself. She was quiet. Then she said, "So you waited until you were actually ready rather than just ready enough?" I said, "Yes, exactly." There is a version of this story that ends with a set of principles extracted and presented at length. I am not interested in that version. The principles are implicit in what happened, and implicit is where they belong. What I will say is this: the value of the work you do is not set by the people who benefit from it without acknowledging it. It exists independently. The account was mine in every way that determined outcomes. When the circumstances changed, the outcomes followed. The VP called on a Thursday morning at 9:40 14. I told him Monday would work. My former CEO left a voicemail that same afternoon. I set my phone face down on the counter and finished making lunch. I never called back.